I'd like to begin with a reading entitled The Many Names for Mother, Father, Parent by Janet Bowring. Blessed is the person who feeds and warms, washes and comforts a child and soothes them in illness, for they shall be called caregiver. Blessed is the person who gives shelter and food, clothing, toys, books and tools, for they shall be called provider. Blessed is the person who opens doors in the child's experience, who explains the puzzling and wonders at the mysterious, for they shall be called teacher. Blessed is the person who shields a child from that which will wither and warp, or who protects a child from abuse and exploitation, who guards against bullying and scorn, for they shall be called defender. Blessed is the person who takes the time to listen, who is there for a child in the darkness, who is aware of the fears, who speaks the words of encouragement in the moments of despair, for they shall be called sustainer. Blessed is the person who guides a child in the search for beauty, who encourages them at what is daunting, who steadies them as they explore new experiences, who fires their aspirations and their dreams, for they shall be called inspirer. Blessed are all these persons who help bring an infant along the many paths to maturity, for in them is the future well-being of humanity. Today is Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all who are celebrating. Mother's Day is a day that is both simple and complicated, and it is a day with a surprisingly complex history. The simple part, in 1914, Woodrow Wilson, then president, established the second Sunday in May as a national holiday dedicated to, quote, a public expression of our love and reverence for the mothers of our country, end quote. The holiday Mother's Day is deliberately spelled Mother''s Day, singular, and not Mother's''s Day, plural, because it is intended as a day set aside not for the celebration of motherhood in the abstract, but for the honoring and cherishing of the actual individual mothers by the people they have mothered. A simple proposition. The complicated part. It turns out that people have complicated experiences of motherhood. Mothering, being mothered, not being mothered, not being able to mother, and many other facets of motherhood. And so there are complicated feelings on all sides of this equation. Mother's Day is complicated enough that I have never preached a Mother's Day sermon that did not make someone unhappy with me. Perhaps today is your chance to be unhappy with me. If so, I hope you will tell me all about it. So you may be experiencing Mother's Day as the simplest thing in the world today, or you may be experiencing it as something complicated. We honor both here, the joy and the complexity. However simple Mother's Day is supposed to be, the path by which we got to the modern holiday was not simple at all. There are actually 3 iterations of Mother's Day from the 1860s to 1914, and although it was the third one that stuck, the modern popular celebration quickly took on a life of its own that does not exactly reflect any of those intentions. In fact, the woman who ultimately was responsible for Mother's Day, the iteration that stuck, she came to hate it. And she spent the last years of her life trying to get rid of it, in fact. But we'll get to that in just a bit. The first iteration of Mother's Day dates back to just before the Civil War, and was the work of a woman named Anne Marie Reeves Jarvis. Anne Marie Reeves was born in Virginia. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister. She married a man named Granville Jarvis, and they moved to the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, where he became quite a successful merchant. His brother was a physician, and they lived in a time and place where childhood diseases ran rampant, and motherhood was particularly extremely precarious. So Anne Marie Reeves Jarvis had 12 children, and only 4 of them survived to adulthood. The others dying of various common diseases. And in response, she began to organize in her community what she called Mother's Day work clubs. And these clubs gathered women together in the churches all in the area without respect to denomination. And the goal was to learn about, drawing on the expert of her physician brother-in-law and modern practices, to learn about modern sanitation practices that they could then bring back into the homes and teach the women in the entire area how to better care for and support their families and especially their children. So this included teaching women how to, for example, inspect milk for signs of contamination or spoilage, which was a huge issue at the time and before there were standards for milk preparation and sale. They taught them how to clean their homes in such a way as to minimize infection. They taught them how to care for people to minimize the spread of disease. And these Mother's Day work clubs were extremely popular. They started in 1858 and they continued on. And during the Civil War, West Virginia, which was considered a northern state, an anti-slavery state, of course, connected to Virginia, a pro-slavery state. And this was also a border region where there was a lot of intense conflict during the Civil War and frequent clashes of armies and frequent gatherings of armies, Union and Confederate, which of course only contributed more to these sort of constant outbreaks of disease. And Anne Marie devoted herself and her Mother's Day work clubs to provide sanitary care for soldiers. And they did this without respect to which side of the war the soldiers were fighting on. That was their commitment, that they would treat anyone regardless of their cause. And at the time, soldiers were just as likely to die of disease as they were to die of violence on the battlefield. So this was actually a tremendous effort. After the war, she continued her activism, only this time she focused on promoting peace in her community because, again, this was a border region that had been terribly divided during the war, even separating families on the issues of which side they would support. And so she reconceived of her Mother's Day clubs as a form of peace activism. And in 1868, she hosted an event she called Mother's Friendship Day. And the idea was to bring together veterans who had fought on both sides of the war to begin the process of reconciliation. This was a radical proposition. There were threats of violence. The day began with a lot of tension, as you can imagine, and it ended in tears and handshakes as the veterans began to come together and begin the process of healing from the war. So Mother's Day, as Anne Marie conceived it, was connected to service in the name of healthy families and peaceful communities. But honoring mothers was important to Anne Marie and something that she strove for all of her life. Her daughter, of whom we will say more later, remembered that one day Anne Marie, who was also a public speaker and lectured in her community on all of these issues, one day she was praying out loud, "I hope and pray that someone sometime will found a memorial Mother's Day commemorating her for the matchless service she provides to humanity in every field of life," concluding, she is entitled to it. That prayer had a profound impact on her daughter, Anna Jarvis, as we shall see. So the second version of Mother's Day that arose about during this same time has a very different and somewhat unlikely source. Julia Ward Howe was born in 1819, a brilliant and supremely accomplished Boston socialite. She was the daughter of a wealthy family. She was raised with every advantage, thoroughly schooled in art, music, language, literature. By young adulthood, she was fluent in French, Italian, German, Latin, and Greek. She once, at the end of her life, advised young women, "Take up Greek. It is worth more than diamonds." She was raised in a severe Calvinist household, but as a young adult, she converted to Unitarianism, and she began to forge strong intellectual and social connections with all of the leading transcendentalist figures of the day, including Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, James Freeman Clarke. And in the course of her life, she became an abolitionist, a feminist, and a peace activist. But she married young to a husband who himself was doing pioneering work, creating schools for children with multiple disabilities. And as a part of that work, they relocated outside of Boston, away from the intellectual social circles that inspired her. And her husband discouraged her from having any pursuits of her own separate from his. He wanted her to devote her life to motherhood and supporting his work. She wanted to be a writer. She published 2 poems. He was angry at this, ridiculed and diminished her aspirations. So her next work was a book of poems inspired by her feelings about her marriage, which was published anonymously, but very quickly became an open secret exactly who these poems were about, and raised more than a few eyebrows in the mister's direction. This is what happens when you cross a writer. During the Civil War, Julia Ward Howe and her husband both served on the Sanitation Commission, which was established by Unitarians to help alleviate disease and suffering among soldiers. This was a huge effort that Unitarians had mobilized to bring health care to the Civil War in the wake of this sort of unprecedented experience of mass warfare. And Julia Ward Howe was in the mix doing the work. And this is where she may have become aware of the work of Anne Marie Jarvis. I've read a lot of articles on this. Some of them make a connection between these 2 women. The details are a little sketchy, so don't hold me to that. She may have been inspired by Anne Marie Reeves Jarvis's example. However it was, what is certain is she came away from the Civil War with an absolute horror for the carnage of war. Even if she is ironically most famous today for having written the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which celebrates war as a martial force, she came away horrified by war. And she came away with a strong drive for activism. In 1868, she co-founded the New England's Women's Club. In 1869, she co-founded the American Women's Suffrage Association. And in 1862, her peace activism and her feminism came together. She called for an International Women's Day of Peace as a response to the slaughter of the Franco-Prussian War, which happened in 1870. She wrote a public letter, which she translated into many languages, and she called on women all around the world to organize their political power for peace. And that was the second vision for Mother's Day. And so I want to share with you now the text of the original Mother's Day Proclamation, 1872, by Julia Ward Howe. Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them take then solemnly counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each bearing after his own kind the sacred impress not of Caesar, but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of Women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. Put that on a Hallmark card. Julia Ward Howe published her appeal far and wide, and then she went to London to try to establish exactly this Congress of Women that she was calling for, but she was not successful. So she returned to America, and she began promoting the observance of a Mother's Day for Peace every second Sunday in June. And she did this locally. This was the second attempt at Mother's Day. It lasted for about 10 years, and then it gradually fell away. So we get now to our third and final iteration of Mother's Day, and we return to the Jarvis family. Specifically, Anne Marie Reeves Jarvis's daughter, Anna. Anne Marie Jarvis died in 1905. The mother died in 1905. Her daughter, Anna, never forgot her mother's prayer that a day would be set aside to honor women. And so she began a tireless campaign to establish the Mother's Day holiday. She began petitioning, like every public official she could think of, that such a day should be created. She chose the second Sunday in May because it would always be close to the date when her mother died. She chose white carnations as the symbol for Mother's Day because it was her mother's favorite flower. And while Anne Marie Reeves had prayed for a Mother's Day that would honor service to humanity, Anna Jarvis wanted Mother's Day to serve as a celebration of the mothers themselves. She held a very large Mother's Day memorial in West Virginia in 1908, and from then, that annual celebration spread, first in West Virginia, then recognized in more and more states, until eventually Anna Jarvis convinced President Woodrow Wilson to declare Mother's Day a national day of celebration. And Mother's Day spread in part because of the enthusiastic support of florists, chocolatiers, and greeting card manufacturers. This happened immediately. By the 1920s, it was already a wildly commercialized holiday. And I am not saying anything against that celebration, but Anna Jarvis herself grew to hate it. And then she grew to fight it, because she wanted Mother's Day to be simple and sentimental and personal, not something that anyone would profit off of. She wanted people to write letters to their moms, not buy them cards. She wanted them to spend time with their moms, not buy them gifts. She was particularly outraged that florists would raise the price of white carnations just in time for Mother's Day. She herself never made a single penny off of the holiday that she was responsible for. And towards the end of her life, she spent what little money she had campaigning to have Mother's Day rescinded. So there you go. There you have it. 3 different visions of Mother's Day. If we were to celebrate all 3 in a way that honors their original intent, we would begin the day by expressing our sincere appreciation, our heartfelt gratitude for those caregivers who had nurtured and supported us in our lives, maybe with breakfast in bed. Then over brunch, we would gather in public councils to plot the overthrow of the patriarchy and the abolition of war. And then in the evening, having solved that problem, we could devote our time and resources to the promotion of health, peace, and safety in our homes and our communities. Not bad for a day's work. However you celebrate, whether you celebrate, whatever the joy or complexity of this day is for you, may we be inspired by these original visions that remind us that it is good to honor those who have nurtured us, and that it is holy work to nurture others in return. It is holy work to nurture others. And then inspire us to lift up the possibilities for us that children can be safe, that communities can be healthy, that peace is possible, and that someday we might just all get there together. Blessed be.